All right, moving on to part D. It says carry out the rest of the significance test. So we just dealt with the first part, dealing with the hypotheses. Now we have to go through the rest of the parts. Remember, anytime we're doing a significance test, we've got four different parts. Hypotheses, which we just did, conditions, we calculate our p-value after that, and then lastly, we do our interpretation given on what our p-value is. So, our conditions, remember the normal condition for mean is if your sample size is 30 or more, then it's going to be approximately normally distributed due to the central limit theorem. Right here, central limit theorem. And since our sample size are both 30, then we know that both samples are approximately normally distributed. So that one checks out. We'll assume that the 10% condition checks out as well, which means that in this case there would just be more than 300 people involved that'd be taking the beta blocker or the placebo, and then it tells us that they're randomized. Again, the two that you really want to make sure that you know how to do, and that can be checking on the AP test, are the randomization and the normality. So make sure that you are comfortable with those. So that's the second part, conditions. The third part is we're dealing with our significance test. So again, it's going to really help you if you think about that general template. We have our statistic minus our parameter divided by the standard deviation. So your statistic, that's the number we got from our sample. So just like we did for the confidence interval, we're going to take our sample mean from sample 1, subtract it from our sample mean from sample 2. And we get that 65.2 minus 70.3, and then we're subtracting it against what we're testing against. So we're testing that there's no difference, testing against if there's no difference. So we're going to always put that 0 as that second number on top. Then on the bottom, we put in our standard deviation formula that we learned in today's first video. So just like we did for the confidence interval, we take our sample standard deviation from sample 1 and sample size from sample 1, plug it into the formula right there. Same thing from sample 2, and we want to calculate this out. So again, don't try putting this all in your calculator at the same time. It's going to be very difficult to get to come out right. So I recommend, just like you see what I did here, is I did the numerator first, and when I subtract those, it comes out to negative 5.1, and when I calculate at the bottom, the standard deviation, that comes out to 2.080. Then I just divide those two, and that came out to, actually, I forgot to write this down, so let me write down what that t-score came out to. Negative 5.1 divided by 2.080. So that comes out to negative 2.45. So that's going to be your t-score. And actually, I have this written down wrong. I put the final p-value in here. That's what we're going to put for our upper boundary. Our lower boundary is going to be negative infinity, and then our degrees of freedom is going to be 29. Again, for degrees of freedom, you take your smallest sample size out of the two, subtract it by 1 to get degrees of freedom. And when you plug that into your calculator, again, you go down to number 6 under distribution, TCDF, and then put negative 1,000 as our lower boundary, negative 2.45 as our upper boundary. And then that gives us a p-value of 0.0102. So again, that's the third step, calculating that p-value given the test statistic. So again, before you go on to the next practice problem, make sure you really spend time on those calculations. Try to do them on your own to make sure you understand exactly what happens in each spot. Also, before I move on, notice how I put the calculator command on my paper, my shown work, and then you want to make sure that you label your t-score and your degrees of freedom right here. Okay, you want to make sure that you're labeling those numbers, because if you don't, then you won't get credit for them in the AP test. They don't really. If you just write TCF, CDF, they don't recognize calculator commands, but you can put that as long as you put down the correct what the t-score is and the degrees of freedom. That's what they're going to be looking for, not the TCDF. So make sure that you label those two different values, the t-score and the degrees of freedom. So this is how we analyze our answer. So we say since our p-value of 0.0102 is less than our significance level of 0.05, we have statistically significant evidence to reject the null hypothesis. We have evidence that the beta blocker reduces pulse rate in patients. So getting that interpretation, you want that first sentence describing if you're rejecting or failing to reject a null hypothesis based off the p-value against the significance level. And then the second sentence is you want to have it interpreted kind of like in non-stats terms in context with the problem, so that somebody who's just reading through that sentence would understand what your results are from the study.